Stephanie St. Clair stepped off the boat at Ellis Island with $10. 10 years later, corrupt cops crossed the street to avoid her. 1911, a 24-year-old woman from Guadeloupe clutched everything she owned. 10 crumpled dollar bills hidden in her dress pocket. She spoke broken English with a thick French accent. No family, no connections, no plan. Just hunger and a promise she'd made to herself crossing the Atlantic. She would never be poor again. The immigration officer barely looked at her. Another Caribbean immigrant heading to Harlem, another invisible face in America's melting pot. He stamped her papers and waved her through. He had no idea he'd just admitted the future queen of Harlem. Stephanie walked 37 blocks to Manhattan carrying a cloth suitcase with 3 dresses, a Bible, and her grandmother's locket. She refused to spend money on a streetcar. Every penny mattered. Every dollar was ammunition for the war ahead. Harlem in 1911 was a contradiction. Beautiful brownstone buildings filled with beautiful black families who'd escaped the South looking for opportunity. But opportunity was scarce. Black men worked as porters, janitors, laborers. Black women worked as maids, cooks, seamstresses. They worked hard, lived modestly, and dreamed their children might have better lives. Stephanie St. Clair had bigger dreams. She found a room on 135th Street, $4 a week for a space barely large enough for a bed and a wash basin. The landlord, a thin white man named Murphy, looked her up and down like she was livestock. "You got work lined up, girl?" Stephanie straightened her shoulders. In her accented English, she said, "Oui. I will find work." Murphy smirked. "You better. I don't run a charity." He took $4 from her precious 10, leaving her with $6 to survive in the most expensive city in America. The first job came quickly. Mrs. Vanderbilt's mansion needed a maid, 12-hour days, $8 a month. Stephanie scrubbed floors and studied how rich people lived, how they talked, dressed, handled money. Most importantly, how they thought. Rich people weren't smarter than poor people. They were more strategic. At night, Stephanie walked Harlem streets. She discovered the numbers game, an illegal lottery where people bet nickels on 3-digit combinations. Winners got 40-1 odds. But Stephanie saw what others missed. The numbers weren't random, they were controlled, and whoever controlled them controlled serious money. But Stephanie also saw something else. Something that would make her enemies with the most dangerous men in New York. The numbers game was run by white mobsters who treated Harlem like a colony. They collected the money, paid the winners, and kept the enormous profits. Black folks did all the work, running bets, collecting money, taking risks, while white men got rich off their labor. It was slavery with extra steps. And Stephanie St. Clair decided she'd seen enough. 1913. 2 years after arriving with $10, Stephanie had saved $53 working as a maid. $53 representing 2 years of 12-hour days, skipped meals, and sleeping in a room barely fit for storage. Most people would have been proud of that savings. Stephanie was furious, not at the amount, but at how she'd earned it. On her knees, serving people who considered her invisible. She quit Mrs. Vanderbilt's mansion on a Thursday morning in March. Walked into the kitchen where she'd spent 2 years scrubbing pots. Looked at the head butler who'd treated her like dirt and said in perfect English, her accent almost gone now, "I quit." The butler laughed. "You'll be back begging for this job within a week." Stephanie smiled. "No, I will not." That afternoon, Stephanie St. Clair became a numbers runner. Not for the white mobsters, for herself. She started small, memorizing every bet, every customer, every winning combination. She worked 18-hour days covering 12 city blocks on foot. Her French accent came back when she needed it, disappeared when she didn't. She could be whatever people needed her to be. Within 6 months, Stephanie had something the white mobsters didn't expect: loyalty. Her customers trusted her because she was one of them. When they won, she paid immediately. When they lost, she never pressured them to bet more than they could afford. When the police raided, she never gave up names. Word spread through Harlem. If you wanted to play numbers, you played with Stephanie. 1915, the Territory War began. Dutch Schultz controlled most of Manhattan's illegal gambling. A violent psychopath who'd killed over 40 people, Dutch didn't believe in negotiations. When he heard about a Caribbean woman running numbers in Harlem, he sent 3 enforcers with a simple message: work for us or stop working. Stephanie met them at her apartment on 135th Street, 3 white men in expensive suits carrying guns and attitudes. The leader, a scarred Irish thug named Kelly, did the talking. "You're the French girl causing problems?" Stephanie stood in her doorway, 5 feet 3 inches of calm defiance. "I am Stephanie St. Clair, and you are trespassing." Kelly laughed. "Lady, this whole neighborhood belongs to Dutch Schultz, including you." He stepped closer. "Here's how this works. You give us your customer list and routes. You keep 20%. Refuse and we burn this building down with you in it." Stephanie looked at each man carefully, memorizing faces, builds, weaknesses. "Gentlemen, you have made a mistake. You think because I am a woman, because I am black, because I am foreign, that I am weak. You are wrong." She stepped closer to Kelly. "I suggest you leave before someone gets hurt." Kelly's hand moved toward his jacket. Stephanie pulled out a pearl-handled revolver, pressing it against Kelly's throat. "The someone who gets hurt will be you." The men backed away. Kelly's face was red with rage. "This isn't over. Dutch doesn't forget." Stephanie never lowered her gun. "Neither do I. Tell Dutch Schultz that Harlem is not for sale, and if he sends more men, he should send better men." After they left, Stephanie sat on her bed and counted her money. She had $347. Enough to disappear, move to another city, start over. But Stephanie St. Clair didn't run from fights. She prepared for them. What she did next would turn a small-time numbers runner into the most feared woman in New York. The war with Dutch Schultz wasn't just about money. It was about respect. About whether a black woman from the Caribbean had the right to control her own destiny in America. Dutch thought the answer was no. Stephanie intended to prove him wrong. She started by doing something unprecedented in the criminal underworld. She organized, not just numbers runners, but the entire underground economy of Harlem. Bootleggers, dice game operators, brothel owners, loan sharks. Everyone who made money outside the law. Stephanie convinced them they were stronger together than apart. Her pitch was simple. The white mobsters take 60% of everything we earn. They provide nothing except the privilege of not being killed. We do the work. We take the risks. We serve the customers. Why do they get the profits? It was a revolutionary idea. Criminal socialism. United we steal, divided we're stolen from. By 1917, Stephanie controlled 17 city blocks. Not through violence, but through economics. She offered better odds than the white mobsters. 40-1 payouts instead of 30-1. She employed over 100 people. Numbers runners, collectors, lookouts, counters. All of them black. All of them loyal. All of them getting paid better than they'd ever been paid in their lives. The legitimate businesses loved her too. Stephanie required every shop owner in her territory to deposit their daily earnings in her bank, a system of hidden safe houses, instead of keeping cash on the premises. In return, she guaranteed protection from robbery. Not from her people, from everyone. Crime in Stephanie's territory dropped to almost zero because everyone had a stake in keeping it peaceful. But Dutch Schultz wasn't interested in peaceful coexistence. In March 1918, he sent 20 armed men to raid Stephanie's headquarters at 2266 7th Avenue. They expected to find a numbers operation run by amateurs. Instead, they found a fortress. Stephanie had turned the 3-story brownstone into a legitimate business. The first floor was a beauty salon. The second floor was a secretarial school. The third floor was residential apartments, all perfectly legal. The numbers operation ran through a system of coded telephone calls, hidden compartments, and rotating locations that changed daily. When Dutch's men kicked in the doors, they found women getting their hair done and students learning to type. But they also found Stephanie St. Clair waiting for them. She sat behind a mahogany desk in the beauty salon, wearing a blue dress and pearl necklace, looking like a successful businesswoman, which she was. As Dutch's men searched the building, finding nothing incriminating, Stephanie made phone calls, not to lawyers or police, to journalists. By the time Dutch's men left empty-handed, reporters from 3 newspapers were waiting outside. Stephanie gave them a statement that would be quoted for decades. Today, 20 white men with guns invaded a legitimate business owned by a black woman. They found nothing because there was nothing to find except hard-working people trying to make honest livings. I asked the citizens of New York, how long will we allow organized crime to terrorize law-abiding citizens? The newspapers ate it up. Harlem businesswoman defies mob intimidation. French immigrant stands up to Dutch Schultz. The Queen of Harlem fights back. Overnight, Stephanie St. Clair became a folk hero, not just in Harlem but across the country. Letters of support poured in from as far as California. Money, too. People sending dollar bills to help that brave woman in New York fight the mob. Dutch Schultz was humiliated. A woman had outmaneuvered him, made him look like a bully and herself look like a victim. Worse, she'd done it without firing a shot. The newspapers were calling him a thug and her a hero. His own men were questioning whether he'd lost his edge. But Stephanie's greatest victory over Dutch Schultz was still coming, and it would involve something no one expected. 1919, the year everything changed, not just for Stephanie St. Clair, but for America. Prohibition began, making alcohol illegal and creating the largest criminal enterprise in human history. Every gang in New York pivoted to bootlegging, including Dutch Schultz. Liquor was more profitable than numbers, easier to transport, and had unlimited demand. Dutch became obsessed with building a whiskey empire. Stephanie saw the opportunity immediately. While Dutch focused on alcohol, she consolidated control over gambling. Not just numbers, but dice games, card games, sports betting. Everything people did for entertainment in Harlem, Stephanie took a piece of. By 1920, her organization employed over 500 people and generated more than $50,000 a month. In today's money, that's over $600,000 monthly. But money wasn't Stephanie's only goal. She wanted power, real power. The kind that couldn't be taken away by men with guns. So she began buying politicians, not with bribes, with information. Stephanie's network of runners, collectors, and operators heard everything. Which police captain was taking money from bootleggers? Which judge was fixing cases? Which city councilman was embezzling funds? Which prosecutor was sleeping with his secretary? Stephanie collected secrets like other people collected stamps. When Police Captain Thomas Murphy tried to shut down her numbers operation, Stephanie invited him to lunch. At a small restaurant in Harlem, she placed a manila envelope on the table between them. Inside were photographs of Murphy taking bribes from Dutch Schultz's men. Bank records showing unexplained deposits in Murphy's account. Hotel receipts proving Murphy was embezzling police department funds to pay for weekend trips with his mistress. "Captain Murphy," Stephanie said in her perfectly controlled English, "I believe we have a misunderstanding. You think I am a criminal who needs to be arrested. I think you are a criminal who needs to be exposed. One of us is mistaken." She slid the envelope across the table. "These documents will be delivered to the New York Times unless my businesses operate without harassment. Do we understand each other?" Murphy's face went pale as he looked through the evidence. His career, his marriage, his freedom. All of it would disappear if those documents became public. "What do you want?" he whispered. Stephanie smiled. "I want you to do your job. Arrest real criminals. Protect honest citizens. And remember that Harlem is a peaceful neighborhood that requires no special attention from the police." From that day forward, Murphy's precinct left Stephanie's operations alone. More importantly, word spread through the police department. Stephanie St. Clair had dirt on everyone. Cross her at your own risk. By 1921, 10 years after arriving in Harlem with $10, Stephanie controlled more territory than any criminal organization in Manhattan. She employed over 1,000 people. She had judges, prosecutors, and police commanders on her payroll. Not through bribery, through blackmail. She owned their secrets, so she owned them. But her greatest victory was still ahead, and it would come through the last person anyone expected to challenge Dutch Schultz, the federal government, 1922. The Internal Revenue Service began investigating Dutch Schultz for tax evasion. They had evidence he'd made millions from bootlegging but had reported almost no income to the government. Dutch faced 20 years in federal prison unless he could prove his income came from legal sources. That's when Dutch made a fatal mistake. He approached Stephanie St. Clair for help, not to ask for mercy or negotiate a truce, to demand that she provide false documentation proving his income came from legitimate gambling partnerships with her organization. The meeting took place at the Cotton Club, the famous Harlem nightclub where black entertainers performed for white audiences. Dutch arrived with 6 bodyguards and an attitude. Stephanie arrived alone and calm. She wore an emerald green dress that cost more than most people made in a year. Diamond earrings that caught the light like stars. She looked like royalty. She was royalty. Dutch didn't waste time on pleasantries. "I need paperwork showing I've been your silent partner for 5 years. Contracts, receipts, bank transfers. Make it look like I invested $2 million in your operation and you've been paying me legal returns." Stephanie sipped her champagne and studied Dutch like he was an interesting insect. "And in return," Dutch laughed, "in return, I don't burn down every business you own and kill everyone who works for you." Stephanie set down her glass. "Mr. Schultz, you are asking me to commit federal perjury to save you from federal prison. The risk to me is enormous. The benefit to me is nothing. Why would I do this?" Dutch's face reddened. "Because if you don't, you're dead." Stephanie nodded thoughtfully. "I see. You want me to choose between definitely going to prison for perjury or possibly being killed by you for refusing. That's not a difficult choice." She stood up to leave. Dutch grabbed her wrist. "Sit down. We're not finished." Every person in the Cotton Club turned to look. A white man putting his hands on a black woman in public, in Harlem, in Stephanie's territory. The room went silent. Stephanie looked down at Dutch's hand on her wrist. Then she looked at his face. When she spoke, her voice carried across the entire club. "Remove your hand from my person immediately, or I will have it removed for you." Dutch tightened his grip. "You're going to help me whether you want to or not." Stephanie smiled, the kind of smile that made smart people nervous. "Actually, I have a better idea. I'm going to help the federal government instead." What Stephanie did next destroyed Dutch Schultz and made her the most powerful criminal in New York. The next morning, Stephanie St. Clair walked into the federal building in Lower Manhattan. She carried a briefcase containing 5 years of meticulously documented records. Every transaction, every payment, every operation Dutch Schultz had conducted in Harlem. Names, dates, amounts, locations, a complete blueprint of his criminal enterprise. The federal agents couldn't believe what they were seeing. No criminal had ever voluntarily provided such detailed evidence against another criminal, especially not evidence this comprehensive. Stephanie had recorded everything because she'd always known this day would come, the day when information became more valuable than money. "Why are you giving us this?" asked Agent Patterson, the lead investigator on the Dutch Schultz case. Stephanie sat across from him in a conference room overlooking the Hudson River. She wore a navy blue business suit and spoke in perfect English. "Because Dutch Schultz threatened to kill me unless I helped him commit federal crimes. I prefer to help the government catch federal criminals." The evidence Stephanie provided was devastating. Bank records showing Dutch had made over $3 million in unreported income. Witness statements from 50 people who could testify about his bootlegging operation. Documentary proof of bribery, extortion, and murder. Enough evidence to convict Dutch of a dozen federal crimes. But Stephanie's information came with conditions. First, her cooperation would remain confidential. The government couldn't reveal she'd been their source. Second, all charges against her organization would be dropped. Third, federal agents would provide protection for her and her employees during the trial. Agent Patterson agreed immediately. The Department of Justice wanted Dutch Schultz more than they wanted any other criminal in America. If Stephanie St. Clair could deliver him, they'd give her anything she asked for. The trial began in October 1923. Dutch Schultz, the most feared gangster in New York, facing 27 federal charges including tax evasion, conspiracy, and racketeering. The evidence against him was overwhelming and perfectly presented. Documents, witnesses, expert testimony, a prosecutor's dream case. Dutch's lawyers tried everything. They claimed the evidence was fabricated. They argued their client was being persecuted for being German during anti-German sentiment following World War I. They suggested the real criminals were the black gangsters in Harlem who were making Dutch a scapegoat. Nothing worked. The evidence was too strong, too detailed, too convincing. On November 15, 1923, Dutch Schultz was convicted on all charges and sentenced to 25 years in federal prison. He would die behind bars in 1935, never knowing who had provided the evidence that destroyed him. That same day, Stephanie St. Clair became the undisputed queen of Harlem. With Dutch gone, no white gangster dared challenge her territory. She controlled gambling, bootlegging, and numerous legitimate businesses across 37 city blocks. Her organization employed over 1,500 people and generated more than $100,000 per month. But money and territory weren't Stephanie's greatest achievements. She'd accomplished something unprecedented in American criminal history. She'd taken on the most powerful gangster in the country and won without firing a shot. She'd used intelligence instead of violence, strategy instead of intimidation, information instead of bullets. The newspapers called her the Black Widow and Harlem's Iron Lady. Police called her untouchable because they couldn't arrest someone who had evidence of their own crimes. Other criminals called her the Queen and meant it with respect, not mockery. 1925. 14 years after arriving with $10, Stephanie St. Clair owned a mansion on Sugar Hill, the most exclusive black neighborhood in America. She employed a staff of 12, drove a Rolls-Royce, and wore jewelry worth more than most people's houses. She'd achieved the American dream through means the American dream never acknowledged. But Stephanie's greatest victory wasn't financial. It was social. She'd proven that a black woman from the Caribbean could outwit, outmaneuver, and outlast the white male power structure that controlled organized crime in America. She'd shown that intelligence was more powerful than violence, strategy more effective than intimidation. Police officers who'd once harassed black citizens now crossed the street to avoid confronting Stephanie's people. Politicians who'd ignored Harlem for decades suddenly showed up to community events when Stephanie endorsed them. Prosecutors who'd railroaded black defendants into prison now found themselves facing federal investigations when they crossed someone under Stephanie's protection. She'd created something that had never existed before in America. A zone where black citizens were protected from both criminal victimization and police harassment, where black businesses could operate without paying tribute to white gangsters, where black families could live with dignity and safety. The secret to Stephanie's success wasn't luck or connections or natural talent. It was preparation. From the moment she stepped off that boat at Ellis Island, she'd been studying, learning, planning. She'd understood that knowledge was power, information was ammunition, and patience was the most dangerous weapon of all. But Stephanie's empire faced its greatest threat yet. And it would come from the one place she never expected. 1929. The stock market crashed, beginning the Great Depression. Legitimate businesses closed, banks failed, unemployment soared. In most of America, illegal gambling decreased as people had less money to bet. But in Harlem, something unexpected happened. Gambling increased. When people are desperate, they take desperate chances. The numbers game offered hope. A nickel bet could win $40. For families struggling to pay rent, buy food, or keep the lights on, those odds seemed reasonable. Stephanie's customer base tripled almost overnight, but success brought scrutiny. As the only person in Harlem making money during the Depression, Stephanie attracted attention from federal agents, ambitious prosecutors, and reform-minded politicians. They couldn't prove she was breaking the law. Her operations were too sophisticated, too well protected. But they could make her life difficult. The pressure came from all directions. Tax investigations, health inspections of her legitimate businesses, immigration reviews of her citizenship status, licensing challenges for her beauty salons and secretarial schools. Death by 1,000 cuts. Stephanie handled each challenge with characteristic intelligence and preparation. She hired the best lawyers, accountants, and public relations professionals in New York. She made large donations to charities, churches, and community organizations. She gave interviews portraying herself as a successful immigrant businesswoman who'd overcome prejudice through hard work and determination. Most importantly, she began transitioning from illegal activities to legitimate investments. Real estate, restaurants, entertainment venues. By 1932, more than 60% of her income came from legal businesses. She was laundering herself out of crime and into respectability. The transformation culminated in 1934 when Stephanie St. Clair was elected to the Harlem Community Council, a position that gave her official influence over local politics and development. She'd achieved something unprecedented, a former criminal becoming a legitimate community leader. But Stephanie never forgot where she came from or who had helped her rise. She used her wealth and influence to fight the same problems that had motivated her criminal career. Police corruption, political neglect, economic exploitation of black communities. When corrupt police officers harassed black citizens, Stephanie provided lawyers. When discriminatory businesses refused to serve black customers, Stephanie organized boycotts. When politicians ignored Harlem's needs, Stephanie endorsed their opponents and funded opposition campaigns. She'd evolved from a criminal who broke bad laws to a citizen who fought for better laws. From someone who operated outside the system to someone who changed the system from within. 1940. 29 years after arriving with $10, Stephanie St. Clair had achieved something beyond money or power. She'd achieved legacy. Not just as a successful criminal, but as a community leader and civil rights pioneer. Her life became inspiration for countless others. A poor immigrant who'd built an empire through intelligence and determination. A woman who'd succeeded in a man's world without compromising principles. A black person who'd gained respect without begging for acceptance. Stephanie St. Clair died in 1969 at age 82, having witnessed the civil rights victories she'd fought for decades earlier. She'd seen integration, desegregation, voting rights legislation. But her greatest satisfaction came from walking through Harlem in her final years. Black-owned businesses thriving on every block, black families in decent housing, black children in good schools with real opportunities. She'd arrived with $10 and a dream, built an empire where others saw only poverty. Proven that in America, with intelligence, courage, and determination, anyone could rise from nothing to everything. Most importantly, she'd shown that true power isn't about money or fear. True power is improving lives, creating opportunities, giving hope to those who come after you. Stephanie St. Clair had done all that and more. She'd arrived with $10 and left a legacy worth millions,